There is a moment in the day you know well, even if you rarely name it. It is not morning when everything begins, and not deep night when you have already fallen asleep. It is the moment when the city settles downward, when the day has ended, but the night has not fully begun. You might be walking, sitting in a car, or closing a door behind you. Nothing remarkable is happening. That is exactly why this moment usually passes without being noticed. The city is no longer as loud as it is during the day. The larger sounds have pulled back, leaving behind smaller, more scattered noises. A car passing in the distance, a door closing somewhere. The ventilation system of a building continues its steady rhythm. Silence does not arrive as emptiness, but as a base layer. It is there enough for you to register it, but not enough to startle you. The light changes as well. Streetlights switch on in a familiar rhythm. Light still spills from windows, but it is softer now. It does not try to reveal everything. It only signals that someone is still there. Between these sources of light are pockets of darkness that your eyes do not really want to examine closely, not because they are frightening, but because they do not demand attention. During the day, light fills every gap. At night, it stands in a few fixed places, as if it has accepted that not everything needs to be seen. You notice your body slowing down. The momentum of the day still lingers, but it no longer dictates every movement. You no longer need to answer messages. You no longer need to react correctly in the right tone. You no longer need to hold the appropriate expression. The roles you carried through the long day begin to fall away, not because you deliberately remove them, but because they are no longer required in this moment. After dark is not a time on a clock. It is a state. It is when you no longer have to be the predictable version of yourself. You are no longer the one who must perform well, remain polite, and keep promises. What remains are thoughts that have not been arranged, things set aside during the day because they were inconvenient, now begin to return. Not loudly, not demanding anything. They are simply there, waiting to be acknowledged. You are not exactly uneasy, but not fully at ease either. There is a very slight sensation, almost impossible to name, an awareness that when everything slows down, things that have always existed become easier to notice. It is not fear, it is the understanding that daylight covers many things, and when that covering thins, you begin to see the shapes of thoughts you usually ignore. You do not try to analyze them. You do not try to push them away. You only observe, the way you look at a familiar street, when it is emptier than usual. Everything is still there, but it looks different. Not better, not worse, just different. The narrator does not stand in front of you to explain what is happening. The narrator does not stand behind you to push you forward. The narrator simply walks with you at the same pace, looking in the same direction. There is no lesson to extract from this moment. There is no conclusion to reach. This is only the beginning where everything is still. A streetlight continues to cast its pale yellow glow onto an empty stretch of road. It does not flicker. It does not move. It does not make a sound. It simply remains there, illuminating the same familiar patch of space as it has on countless nights before and will on countless nights to come. From the moment you stand still beneath the evening streetlight, it is easy to believe that the feeling belongs only to you. But if you widen your view just a little, you begin to see that this is not a private experience. It is a collective state, a sensation shared by many people in many places during a certain period of time without ever needing to be spoken aloud. The Victorian era is often remembered as an age of confidence, a period when people believed they were moving in the right direction. Everything seemed to be advancing. Cities expanded. Systems ran more smoothly. Life was organized more tightly than ever before. From the outside, it appeared to be an age of order, of control, of faith, that the world had finally become understandable. Progress was no longer an abstract idea. It appeared in the smallest details of everyday life. Machines replaced human labor. Railways connected distances once considered unreachable. Life moved faster, more precisely, and seemingly more efficiently. People grew accustomed to the idea that everything could be arranged, measured, and predicted. Science became the great promise of this era, a promise that nothing would remain mysterious for long, that with enough patience and intelligence, humanity could explain everything from the body to the mind. Reason was placed at the center as a tool both reliable and safe. Believing in science was not only believing in knowledge, but believing that the world would no longer surprise you in dangerous ways. Alongside this came a clear moral system. People knew what was acceptable and what was not. They knew how to behave, what to say, and when to remain silent. These norms created a sense of stability. When everyone understood their role, society functioned smoothly. The surface of life became tidy, polite, and seemingly free of chaos. But order on the outside did not mean peace on the inside. While cities became more tightly organized, the human mind did not change at the same pace. Old fears did not disappear simply because new machines existed. Questions that had long troubled people were not automatically answered just because science advanced. They were pushed beneath the surface not because they were resolved, but because they were no longer permitted to appear. A quiet contradiction lived within this era. On the outside, everything looked more stable than ever. On the inside, many people felt uneasy without knowing why. They lived within systems designed to minimize risk, yet carried anxieties they could not name. Thoughts that did not fit the image of civilization were held back in silence. The mind did not move in step with progress. The human body adapted to new rhythms, but the mind still carried older reflexes. Fears that once helped ancestors survive did not vanish simply because streets grew wider or lights grew brighter. They waited patiently in the pauses that daylight did not allow to exist. And that is when night stories emerged, not as mere entertainment, but as a safe space. During the day, people needed order to live together. At night, they needed a place to touch what could not be spoken while the lights were on. Stories allowed this to happen without breaking the system. You could face fear without admitting it was your own. These stories were not meant to destroy order. On the contrary, they existed because order had become too tight. They allowed the mind to breathe indirectly. They spoke for what could not be said directly. You did not need to believe them. Listening was enough. At this point, nothing truly frightening had appeared yet. There were no clear shapes, no defined darkness, only a faint sense of anticipation, like the moment you realize the room you are standing in is not as quiet as you thought. Order remains intact, the lights are still on, but something beneath the surface is waiting to be seen when the night deepens. From the vague sense that order is not as sealed as it appears, you begin to notice a more specific anxiety forming. It is not the fear of chaos, not the fear that everything will collapse at once. It is the fear of intrusion, the sense that something is standing at the edge of the system, not belonging to it, yet still capable of stepping inside. In a society built on order and clear classification, the stranger is always a source of tension, not because they have done something wrong, but because they do not follow the unspoken rules everyone else has learned. They do not speak in the right tone, do not respond at the right pace, and do not understand the invisible boundaries the community depends on to feel safe. This era places great importance on knowing where everyone belongs. Class origin and morality are sorted into separate compartments. Each person is expected to remain in the proper place. When everything is clearly categorized, society runs smoothly. But that same clarity makes anything that cannot be placed into a category immediately seem suspicious. Dracula, when seen as a social symbol, is not a specific individual. He is the condensation of many fears at once. He comes from the outside, not only geographically, but systemically. He does not follow familiar logic. He does not live by the rhythms society accepts. He is not bound by agreed moral rules. This fear does not stop at cultural differences. It connects to a larger obsession illness. Disease needs no passport. It requires no invitation. It spreads quietly, breaking the illusion that living correctly guarantees protection. In an age that believes in science and control illness, reminds people that some things cannot be fully managed. Illness exposes an uncomfortable truth. It does not care how moral you are, how polite you behave, or where you stand in society. It crosses every boundary people try to construct. Because of this, fear of illness is not only fear of physical harm, but fear of how fragile the trusted system of order truly is. Alongside this runs the fear of desire, a quieter fear, but no less powerful. Desires that are not permitted to appear openly are pushed beneath the surface of social life. They do not disappear. They wait in silence. Dracula, in the way society imagines him, becomes the image of that temptation, not through specific actions, but through presence. He represents the possibility that what has been repressed can move beyond control. Faced with these fears, society does not react with immediate attack. It reacts with defense. Doors are closed. Rules are reinforced. Boundaries are drawn more sharply. Who is allowed inside and who is not? What is accepted and what must be excluded? These actions do not come from cruelty, but from the desire to keep the system functioning. The tension, therefore, never explodes. It stretches, a continuous state of vigilance. Society seems to be holding its breath, trying to maintain stability, while knowing no wall is absolute. People do not speak of this fear directly. They speak of laws, of morality, of order. But beneath those words lies the same concern that something exists which cannot be fully controlled. You can imagine a closed door. Inside is light, familiarity, accepted rules. Outside is undefined darkness, not necessarily dangerous, but unpredictable. The door does not move. There is no knocking. Yet its very existence is enough to keep those inside in a constant state of defense. After the tension of holding doors shut and defining boundaries, a shift happens that is almost unnoticeable. Fear no longer stands outside society. It quietly moves into a more private space. It does not need to break any rules. It does not need to cross any doors. It is already in the room you believe to be the safest, where there is only you and the image of yourself. You live in a world where how you look gradually becomes a measure. No one says it out loud, but everyone understands. The gaze of others passes over you, not only to recognize you, but to evaluate you. You learn to adjust yourself to those gazes, not because you are being false, but because you want to remain undisturbed. Appearance becomes a language, and you learn to speak it fluently. There is a particular feeling when you realize that if you look the right way, many questions will never be asked. People become less curious about what lies underneath when the surface is beautiful enough. Beauty not only attracts, but it also protects. It softens suspicion. It makes the sharper edges inside seem less in need of examination. Within this space, morality does not disappear. It simply steps back, not denied, but moved to a position that causes less inconvenience. The choices you make do not need to be weighed immediately. The consequences, if they exist, seem to belong somewhere else, a private place where you do not have to look every day. The portrait understood this way is not merely an object. It is a substitute space, a place to deposit what cannot appear in real life. Thoughts that do not fit, desires that are inconvenient to admit, deviations you do not want attached to your face. You do not destroy them. You only move them elsewhere so they do not disturb the image you are maintaining. This process is not loud. There is no moment you can point to and say that everything began to go wrong here. It unfolds slowly, almost politely. Each time you choose to preserve appearance, instead of facing what is unappealing inside, you feel relieved. There is no reason to worry. Everything is still fine, at least in the way others see it. The coldness of decay lies precisely there. It does not arrive as a crisis. It arrives with a delay. As always, having another place to store what is uncomfortable. The belief is that as long as the surface does not change, you are still the same person. You begin to equate yourself with the image you present outward and gradually forget that it is only a part of you. There is a very subtle sense of control in his process. You believe you are in command of the situation. You know how to appear. You know when to smile, when to remain silent. The surface stays smooth, stays correct. That brings a feeling of safety, but that safety is built on not looking at the place where you have stored the unwanted parts. You do not need to think about the portrait every day. You may even forget it exists for long stretches of time, but it is still there, quietly recording what you do not allow to appear on your face. It does not object. It does not demand. It only accumulates. Beauty in this moment stands still. It does not age. It does not change. Light continues to fall across the familiar surface, and everything appears to be fine. Somewhere in a space that does not require light, what has been denied remains still carrying everything that was never allowed to be revealed. After becoming accustomed to hiding the unwanted parts of yourself, there is a next step that people reach very easily. Not only concealing anymore, but creating. Not only rearranging what already exists, but actively intervening in the existing order. At this point, everything no longer revolves around image or appearance. It revolves around power. The power to bring into existence something that has never existed before. The ambition to create does not always come from harmful intent. It often begins with the belief that if you are intelligent enough and determined enough, you can do better than what already exists. You look at a world and see its gaps. You believe you can fill them, not to break order, but to complete it. In that moment, ambition looks like responsibility. But creation always carries an unspoken condition. When you bring something into existence, you also bind yourself to it. Whether you acknowledge it or not, that connection has already formed. The problem does not lie in the act of creating, but in the moment that follows. When the initial exhilaration fades, when the result is no longer an idea, but a concrete presence, you are forced to face a question you were not prepared to answer. There is a very brief moment between completion and withdrawal, a pause where you realize that what you have created is not only an achievement, but a responsibility. It looks back at you, not with accusation, but with undeniable existence. And in that moment, many people turn away, not because they want to cause harm, but because they cannot bear the feeling of having to stay. Refusing responsibility is rarely spoken aloud. It usually appears as an absence, no guidance, no care, no acknowledgement. You allow what you created to exist on its own, hoping that somehow it will find its place. But silence is not neutral. It is a choice with consequences. For the abandoned one, the world begins without a map. There is no language to understand what is happening. No one explains why you exist or what you are meant to become. There is only a bare presence within an environment not designed for you. Every early encounter becomes formative, and most of them are rejection. The tragedy here does not lie in being created differently. It lies in being left alone with that difference. When no one guides you, every reaction from the world becomes a lesson. And if the world responds with fear, with disgust, with exclusion, then those are the lessons you learn, not through words, but through repeated experience. Society mirrors abandonment with striking consistency. What is unfamiliar is pushed away. What does not fit is treated as a threat. No individual malice is required. The system operates that way on its own, and the abandoned one, in the effort to find recognition, begins to react. Not because of inherent evil, but because no other options remain. At this point, every possibility of repair has become fragile. You cannot return to the moment of creation and begin again. You cannot erase what has happened with a late decision. Each early withdrawal laid the foundation for what followed. The cycle has started, and it does not stop simply because someone recognizes the mistake. The weight of this story comes from the absence of a clear exit. There is no neat solution. No rescue arrived in time. Some things once brought into existence without being properly carried out generate consequences that exceed the original intention, not because they were created, but because they were left behind. When you stand before the result of such an action, the most haunting aspect is not difference but isolation, an isolation that cannot be reversed by apology or delayed regret. The consequences have been activated and they continue to spread without requiring further force. This story does not close with a clear ending. It stops at the moment when you realize that some actions, even those that begin with ambition or good faith, can still lead to outcomes that cannot be undone. And when that happens, the only thing that remains is the trace of an abandonment that has become part of the world. After all consequences have been set in motion and there is no way back, what remains is not always chaos. Sometimes what remains is an extended stillness, a stillness that does not bring peace, but holds you in place, refusing to let you move forward, while also refusing to let you forget. The space narrows now. There is no longer a society with its chain reactions, no system left to blame or lean on. There is only you and a room. The room does not need to be dark. It only needs to be quiet enough for everything else to become clearer. Familiar objects remain where they belong, but they offer no help. They only remind you that time is still moving, even if you are not moving with it. Grief in this moment does not explode. It does not seek attention. It does not scream. It exists more durably, like a small weight that is never lifted. You do not have to think about what was lost, yet its absence keeps slipping between other thoughts, leaving them incomplete. Then there is a sound, not something large, not a clear call. It may be only a small, repeated noise or a familiar rhythm you cannot remember hearing before. It does not startle you. It simply exists just enough to keep you from fully relaxing. When you try to ignore it, you realize you are listening more closely than before. The sound returns, not by any clear rule, not regularly, but often enough that you begin to wait for it. In the spaces of silence, you notice you are counting time, not by a clock, but by whether it appears or not. When it does not come, you do not feel relief. You feel something is missing. The repetition does not belong only to the sound. It seeps into your thoughts. The same idea returns carrying the same weight, the same unfinished feeling. You do not go deeper into it. You do not move past it. It simply circles as if your mind is trapped in a corridor with no exit. Each loop changes nothing except increasing the fatigue. There are moments when you wonder whether you are doing something wrong, but that question goes nowhere as well. It becomes part of the loop. You are not searching for meaning. You are not analyzing the structure of what is happening. You are simply inside it, with the sound, with the repetition, with the sense that something refuses to stop. The discomfort comes from the absence of a climax. There is no point where you can say, this is when everything is at its worst. Everything only thickens slowly, like a fog that does not lift. You cannot point to it, but you feel it everywhere, in the pauses between thoughts, in the moments when you believe you have forgotten only to realize that nothing has truly disappeared. The sound continues, not louder, not clearer, but not fading either. It exists alongside you as proof that some things do not need explanation to earn the right to remain. You do not try to name it. You only know that it is not ready to leave, and perhaps neither are you. After the endless loops of sound and thought, there comes a moment when you begin to suspect that the problem no longer lies outside you, not the room, not the darkness, not the sound with no clear source, but you. An unsettling feeling, as if what is disturbing you is not a foreign presence, but something that has been there for a long time. You grow up with the idea that a person is a whole, a unified individual with character, with morals, with clear principles. You are taught that if you are a good person, you will do good things. If you believe in what is right, you will act accordingly. Everything is presented as a straight line, but lived experience rarely follows that shape. You begin to realize that day and night differ in more than light. They differ in who you become. During the day, you know what to do, what to say, and how to behave. You move smoothly within accepted roles. But when night falls, when those demands temporarily disappear, other parts of you begin to surface. not because they are newly created, but because they are no longer being pushed back. Hypocrisy, in this context, is not always a conscious choice. It is often a survival mechanism. You learn to divide yourself to exist within a system that does not accept the whole of who you are. One part is brought into the light, refined, acknowledged. The other part is hidden not because it is entirely bad, but because it does not fit. Two selves begin to exist side by side within the same body, not in a dramatic way, but in a very ordinary one. One knows how to follow rules, how to maintain an image, how to say the right things. The other carries desires, anger thoughts you cannot present to others. Both are you. Both are real. The problem is not the existence of these two parts. The problem is that they are not allowed to meet. When one part is pushed down for too long, it does not disappear. It accumulates. It waits. And in moments of fatigue, instability, or lowered guard, it looks for a way to surface, not to destroy, but to be acknowledged. There is no pure evil in this story. No part of a person is born solely to cause harm. Actions, society labels, as bad, often grow out of parts that have been suppressed, denied, or forbidden. When there is no safe space for them to exist, they find exits in distorted ways. Your inner rhythm during this phase becomes hurried. Thoughts overlap. There is no clear pause. You are no longer sure what you are reacting to, or from which place within yourself the reaction comes. There are moments when you realize you have just done or thought something that your daytime self would never allow. That realization does not feel liberating. It feels disorienting. The deepest instability does not come from realizing that you have more than one face. It comes from the fear that you no longer control the boundary between them, that you do not know which one will appear next, that the unity you once trusted may have been nothing more than a surface held together by habit and social pressure. You try to return to the earlier state when things seemed clearer, but once you have recognized fragmentation, it becomes difficult to pretend it does not exist. Every decision grows heavier because you are no longer choosing only an action, but choosing which part of yourself is allowed to lead. There is no easy reconciliation here, no moment when the two parts merge into a harmonious whole. The story does not promise that. It only shows an uncomfortable reality that a person can live an entire life in a divided state, trying to keep the parts from colliding too violently. And sometimes, that very effort is what makes everything more unstable. At this point, you are no longer certain where you stand within yourself, not because you have become someone else, but because you have begun to see what was previously hidden. The two selves are still there, coexisting within one body, neither fully winning, neither disappearing. And the tension between them continues to quietly shape whatever you do next. After you have grown used to the idea that a person is not a seamless whole, another shift takes place just as quietly. Instability no longer stays contained within you. It begins to spread outward, seeping into spaces you once believed were neutral, the places you inhabit, the walls that surround you every day. At first, a house is simply a place, a structure, a collection of rooms, corridors, and windows. It has a clear function: to shelter, to contain, to draw a boundary between inside and outside. But when you remain in a space long enough, you begin to sense that it is not entirely inert. It does not respond, but it records. It does not speak, but it retains. Every house carries a history without needing anyone to tell it. What once happened there does not disappear when people leave. It settles layers. Itself blends into the air, into the scent, into the way light enters through the windows at certain hours of the day. You do not need to know exactly what occurred. You only need to stay long enough to feel that something is not entirely new, even if this is your first time inside. The environment shapes the mind in ways that are difficult to notice while they are happening. You do not wake up one morning thinking this house is changing you. The change arrives slowly through habit, through the way you move through space, through the rooms you avoid without knowing why, through where you choose to sit, where you choose to stand, and which corners you avoid looking at. There is no single event you can point to and say everything started there. There is only the sense that the space feels heavier than it needs to be, not because it is dark, not because it is decaying. It may be intact, clean, even beautiful, but there's a faint pressure always present that makes you feel you must adjust, become smaller, more careful. This sense of suffocation does not arrive with clear fear. You do not think something is about to happen. You simply feel as though you are in a place not entirely meant for you, even though you have been there for a long time. The space seems to have its own rhythm, and that rhythm does not match yours. You adapt, but adaptation costs energy. Gradually, the boundary between you and the house begins to blur, not in a mystical way, but in a very ordinary one. You start to notice your mood shifting with different rooms. Some spaces allow you to breathe more easily, while others make you uneasy for no clear reason. The house does nothing, yet its presence is constantly felt. Familiar corridors that once offered comfort become passages you move through more quickly than necessary. Old rooms where you once spent long hours begin to feel slightly wrong. Nothing has changed physically. The furniture remains. Light still falls in familiar patterns, but the feeling is different. Familiarity, when it accumulates too many memories, can become a burden. Every corner reminds you of a state you once inhabited. Every wall holds the echo of thoughts that passed through. The house does not need to act. The fact that it remains unchanged while you have changed is what makes everything heavier. You do not try to decide whether this is real or imagined. You do not search for a name for the sensation. You only know that this environment is affecting you in ways you do not fully control. Space is no longer a neutral backdrop. It becomes part of your psychological experience, even though you never agreed to that arrangement. There are moments when you stand still in a room and feel as though the house is there before you, not as an object, but as a presence, not confrontational, not threatening, simply there carrying everything it has recorded. You do not know what it remembers, and perhaps that does not matter. What matters is that you feel the weight of accumulation. When this part comes to an end, the house remains still. There is no sign of collapse. No obvious change takes place. Everything looks exactly as it did before. But you know you are no longer moving through this space in the same state as when you began. Something has shifted not in the house, but in the way you exist within it. After spending enough time in spaces heavy with memory, you begin to realize that not everything pushed aside truly disappears. Some things do not leave. They simply sink beneath the surface, finding ways to exist in layers the official order never reaches. You do not see them directly, but you feel their presence the way you hear a sound rising from beneath the floor without ever seeing its source. Genius in a society built on norms is often a problem, not because the talent is useless, but because it is difficult to place. When exceptional ability comes with deviation, society hesitates. It does not know whether to celebrate it or control it. And in that hesitation, the easiest response is exclusion. You do not need an act of violence to push someone out. You only need to not invite them in. Not to create a space where they can appear legitimately. Not to know what to call them. Gradually, they vanish from the surface of life, even though they still exist somewhere very close. This exclusion happens quietly, so quietly that no one feels they have done anything wrong. Music in that condition is no longer art meant for performance. It becomes the only voice left, not to be applauded, but to assert that existence continues. Sound slips through forbidden corridors, through thick walls, through levels no one pays attention to. It does not seek recognition. It simply refuses to disappear. But living beneath the surface has its cost. When you are not seen as a complete human being, you begin to see the world through a distorted lens. Rare interactions become magnified. A small gesture carries too much weight. A glance turns into evidence of hope. In prolonged isolation, every emotion is compressed. And when it finally finds an outlet, it no longer keeps its original shape. Love in this context is no longer a meeting between two equal people. It becomes a warped attachment, unbalanced, asymmetrical. One side looks to the other as a sole source of life, while the other cannot or does not know how to respond in kind. This does not come from malice. It comes from deprivation. You may feel compassion for such an existence, and you should, but compassion does not mean romanticizing. Understanding pain does not mean turning it into something beautiful. Some conditions deform people, and acknowledging that does not make the outcome more acceptable. It only makes it more understandable. Tragedy does not form because someone is born to become a monster. It forms because there is no safe space for differences to exist healthily. When you are pushed down for too long, you not only lose your place in society, you lose the ability to regulate emotion according to a shared rhythm. Everything becomes more extreme than it needs to be. The most dangerous aspect of exclusion is not that it creates suffering, it is that it distorts the way people connect. When there is no chance to learn how to love ordinarily, what remains is possession, clinging, and a repeated fear of abandonment. No one in this cycle is truly saved. You are not invited to admire this suffering. You are only invited to look at it directly, to see that unprotected genius can become a burden to the one who carries it. That love without a healthy context can harm everyone it touches. The music continues to rise from below. It may be beautiful, it may be complex, it may cause you to stop and listen, but it does not open any doors. It does not return anyone to the surface. It is only proof that an existence continues caught between the desire to be seen and the reality of exclusion. And in that echo, the tragedy is not resolved, only prolonged. After facing a tragedy that finds no personal way out, a very natural need appears. Not the need for salvation, but the need for stability. When pain cannot be resolved at the human level, society looks for ways to handle it at the level of systems, not to erase the past, but to prevent it from repeating. There are spaces built not for living, but for functioning. Places people enter, every day perform the same tasks and follow the same rhythm. In these spaces, the individual fades, and the system rises to the surface. Everything is designed to keep running regardless of who comes in or leaves. It is in places like these that distortions are easiest to bury, not because someone is deliberately hiding them, but because no one has the time to stop and look closely. When ghost stories appear in such places, they rarely take the form of direct threats. There are no attacks, no shocking scenes. There is only repetition, a sense that something refuses to leave, a presence tied to the familiar rhythm of operation as if it were part of the mechanism itself. Ghosts in this case do not appear to spread fear. They appear as signs of a misaligned order. They are bound to what once happened but was never properly acknowledged. Errors that were overlooked. Losses treated as necessary. People are reduced to operational costs. What is frightening is not the image of the ghost, but what it represents. It is unprocessed memory, delayed justice, not because the system does not know, but because acknowledgement would slow everything down, and in a society that worships efficiency, slowing down is often seen as unacceptable. But memory does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. It finds ways to exist in the smallest cracks, in repeated sounds, in unexplained malfunctions, in the feeling that a space is heavier than it needs to be. Ghosts do not ask for revenge. They ask for an order, a more accurate order even if it arrives late. What is notable is that the solution does not lie in confronting the presence. No one needs to fight. No one needs to drive anything away. What is required is simpler and more difficult. The truth needs to be spoken, not to punish, but to acknowledge. When what happened is named correctly, the loop begins to loosen. Truth has a particular effect on systems. It does not destroy them immediately, but it changes how they continue to operate. When what was hidden is brought into the light space, no longer has to strain to keep a secret. Pressure eases, not because everything is forgiven, but because it is no longer denied. The release here is not personal. No one is saved in a romantic sense. There is no complete ending. There is only a small adjustment, but one large enough to matter. Order no longer relies on omission, but on recognition. This does not make the system perfect. It only makes it less heavy. You feel the change not through major events, but through atmosphere. The space still functions. Machines still run. People still come and go. But the silence is different. It is no longer as tense as before, as if something has been set down after being held for too long. This is a conditional release. It does not erase every problem. It does not guarantee that mistakes will not happen again, but it allows the system to continue without carrying the same invisible burden. The ghosts do not disappear in a way you can point to. They simply no longer need to be there. When you leave this space, you do not carry complete relief with you. You carry a different awareness that sometimes what keeps things stuck is not malice, but silence stretched beyond what is necessary. And when that silence is broken in the right way, order does not collapse. It simply shifts just enough to keep going. After the order has been adjusted through truth, you might think that all tension has eased. But there is another kind of tension that has nothing to do with justice or systems. It does not ask to be resolved. It does not need to be placed correctly. It simply exists like an undercurrent, soft yet persistent, and very difficult to name. Some desires have no safe vocabulary. They do not fit within established frameworks, so they are not spoken of directly. Not because they are too intense, but because they are too indistinct. You feel them before you understand them. They arrive as a tension that lingers longer than necessary, as a sense of familiarity that comes too quickly. Desire in this case does not arrive with noise. It comes quietly, almost politely. It does not force you to act. It only suggests a possibility, a closeness without a clear label. And because there is no label, you do not know where to place it within your system of understanding. What makes this feeling distinctive is that it always arrives alongside fear, not fear of punishment, but fear of not fully understanding what is happening. You are drawn in yet alert. You want to move closer, but you do not fully trust yourself. Attraction and fear do not take turns. They move together. Prohibition does not create desire, but it intensifies it. When a feeling is not allowed to appear openly, it is forced to exist in the gaps. And in those gaps, it is not regulated by language or ritual. It develops on its own terms, shaped by imagination and anticipation. You do not need to label this feeling as right or wrong to feel its impact. Morality in this context offers little guidance. It is designed to regulate clear actions, not to handle ambiguous states. When familiar reference points are absent, you are forced to listen to your own sensations, even when that is uncomfortable. There is a kind of intimacy that does not bring safety. It is not built on full mutual understanding. It is built on rapid closeness, as if two people are touching the same absence. Boundaries become difficult to define. You are not sure who is leading or whether anyone is truly in control. The tension here does not erupt into conflict. It stretches. It holds you in a state of waiting where every small gesture carries more meaning than it should. You read too much into signals, not because they are clear, but because you lack other guides. Everything feels soft, but not light. You are not invited to judge this feeling. You are only invited to recognize that it exists and that it carries weight. When a society does not offer a safe space for ambiguous desires to be acknowledged, they do not disappear. They become more subtle, harder to grasp, and therefore harder to control. This soft tension does not leave obvious wounds. It leaves fatigue, a sense that you have been in a prolonged state of vigilance, even without a clear threat. You cannot point to the moment things went too far, but you know you were never fully at ease. When this part comes to an end, nothing is resolved completely. The desire still has no name. It is not driven away, nor is it fully accepted. It settles for now as many feelings do, not because it has weakened, but because such things rarely vanish. They wait for another context, another pause to return, in the way they always have. After moving through tensions without names, a question begins to take shape slowly, but persistently. It does not arrive as a challenge. It comes as hesitation, a moment when you pause and wonder whether what you have felt, what you have connected with what you have trusted, truly holds. What makes this question most unsettling is its direction. It does not point at the stories, the spaces, or the people you have just passed through. It turns back towards you. What if you are wrong? Not wrong about a small detail, but wrong about how you have assembled the pieces. Wrong about believing you were seeing the whole picture. You have listened, you have observed, you have connected. You believe you have done so carefully. But perception is rarely neutral. It is always shaped by where you stand, by what you are ready to believe, by what you unconsciously overlook. Conclusions that seem reasonable may rest on foundations far less stable than you think. At this point, the narrative voice no longer remains at a safe distance. Cracks begin to show, not through a confession of deception, but through an admission of limits. What has been told to you is not the complete story. It never was. It is a series of choices, choosing which details to keep, which feelings to emphasize, which connections to treat as meaningful. This does not make the story worthless, but it does make the narrator no longer fully reliable, not because there is an intention to mislead, but because no one can tell a story without standing somewhere. And where you stand always shapes what you see. Memory does not function as an accurate record. It is a process of rearrangement. The details that survive are not always the most important ones, but the ones that fit the story you are telling yourself. When you look back, you are not simply recalling what happened. You are interpreting it through the frameworks you have now. The problem is not whether you remember correctly. The problem is believing that your way of remembering is the only possible one, that the connections you see are obvious when they may only be convenient. When that awareness begins to wobble, the unease does not come from losing information, but from losing ground. You are no longer sure what you are standing on. Conclusions that once offered safety now feel provisional. Nothing is fully rejected, but nothing remains as a solid truth. Everything exists in a state of possibly true, but also possibly not. What stands out is that no attempt at correction is offered here. No new truth arrives to replace what has loosened. No final explanation is handed to you to hold on to. Instead, there is only the acknowledgement that perhaps the way you ask the questions shaped the answers from the beginning. At this moment, the narrator is no longer a stable anchor. The voice continues, but you begin to hear it differently. You notice the pauses and the evasions, the places passed over more quickly than necessary, not because something is being hidden, but because not everything can be seen at once. This fracture does not immediately lead to chaos. It leads to suspension. You do not fall, but you do not stand firmly either. You keep moving, but you are no longer sure you are following a straight line. And perhaps that is unavoidable once you begin to doubt the compass you have been using all along. This part does not close with an answer. It does not try to convince you that everything is relative. It leaves you with the sense that storytelling, like understanding the world, always carries the risk of distortion. And once you recognize that you cannot return to your original trust, the voice remains, but it no longer promises certainty. It simply continues with you in the awareness that perhaps from the beginning, neither of you was seeing the same thing in quite the same way. After you begin to doubt the way you see the world itself, another sensation appears quietly but persistently. It does not come from thought, but from the body. An intuition that is difficult to dismiss. The sense that you are not entirely alone, even when every sign says you are within your own private space. You see no one. There is no movement, no unfamiliar sound. Yet the feeling of presence does not fade. It does not occupy a specific position. It does not move in a way you can track. It simply exists like another layer of air, thin but continuous, making it impossible for you to fully relax. What is frightening is not the possibility that someone is watching you. It is the fact that you cannot determine whether that is true or not. There is no evidence to confirm it, but nothing that fully denies it either. You begin to notice very small moments, subtle shifts in your daily rhythm, not because they are unusual, but because you are no longer sure they come entirely from you. Even when you are alone, the sense of privacy is no longer complete. There is no place you can point to and say that here you are entirely safe. This invisible presence does not intrude violently. It does not break the space. It only occupies part of your awareness, just enough to make everything else feel uncertain. From the sense of being observed, another worry slowly forms. Not that you will be harmed, but that you are being replaced. Not in a dramatic instant, but gradually. Thoughts you once believed were your own appear faster than you can catch them. Familiar reactions no longer feel fully rooted in conscious choice. You begin to wonder whether something exists alongside you, not outside, but within the gap between thought and action. It does not need to command. It does not need to be forced. It only needs to remain present long enough, consistently enough, to shape how you respond. And because there is no clear moment of takeover, you do not know when the replacement began. This invisible fear is stronger than fears with form. When you face something defined, you can name it, react to it, or avoid it. But when the object has no boundary, you do not know where to aim your vigilance. You become exhausted from remaining alert without knowing what you are alert against. Being watched is not only about being seen, it is about being shaped. When you feel seen, even without knowing by whom, you begin to adjust yourself. You think more carefully before acting. You weigh your reactions, not because someone is judging, but because the possibility of judgment never disappears. This invisible presence does not need to intervene directly. It is controlled by existing. What makes this experience isolating is that you cannot fully share it. If you speak about it, you are not sure what you are describing. There is no evidence to present, no clear phenomenon for others to confirm. You have only your sensation, and once spoken aloud, it sounds fragile even to you. You begin to notice pauses in your thinking, brief moments when you are unsure what you were about to do. Not memory loss, just a slight interruption, enough to make you wonder who was guiding that moment. There is no answer, and it is the absence of an answer that allows the fear to persist. This part offers neither confirmation nor denial. No one appears to tell you that you are right, and no one arrives to prove that you imagined everything. The sense of being watched remains unchanged, neither growing nor fading. It simply continues like a new baseline for your experience. When you move into the next part, you do not carry a specific threat with you. You carry a different awareness that some fears do not need a visible form to exist, and that once you have felt an invisible presence like this, it becomes very difficult to return to the belief that you are entirely the owner of your space and of your own thoughts. After the invisible fear of being watched and replaced, a more frightening shift appears because it is clear, no longer a vague sensation in the air, no longer an intuition without a name. This time, fear has an address. It has a shape. It has four walls and a door that closes behind you for reasons that sound entirely reasonable. The room is introduced as a place of safety, a place to rest, a place where you do not have to face the outside world too much. Every explanation sounds caring. You are told this is necessary, that you are tired, that you need quiet. And because these words are spoken in a calm voice, it is difficult to argue. Control rarely arrives as a blunt command. It comes in the form of understanding, of people who believe they know what is best for you. Each small decision taken away carries a reasonable justification. You do not need to go outside. You do not need to think too much. You do not need to decide. And because you are exhausted, giving up autonomy feels like relief. But this room does not only limit your movement, it shapes your rhythm. Time moves differently when space does not change. The walls are always there. Light falls into the same corner every day. Patterns repeat until you cannot help but see them. There are no new events to separate today from yesterday. At first, you comply. You believe this will pass, that this is only a phase. But as days follow days, you begin to realize that this quiet is not neutral. It asks you to become smaller, to think less, to feel less, to exist less, and that even when called healing, it's still a form of control. When all choices narrow, the mind looks for escape in unexpected paths, not through grand actions, but through attention. You begin to look more closely at details you would once have ignored, lines on the walls, repeating patterns, places that do not quite align. Repetition becomes the object of thought because there is nothing else to hold on to. Madness in this context does not arrive as a collapse. It arrives as a reorganization, a way for the mind to create movement when the body is held still. When you are not allowed to leave, you move inward. When you are not allowed to decide, you find ways to assert your presence that no one else can fully control. There is a very thin boundary between compliance and erasure, and when you are pushed too close to that boundary, resistance can take forms that society does not recognize. Not loud, not considered reasonable, but still resistance, by refusing to become completely passive, by preserving a small corner of consciousness that no one else can reach. At this point, the narrator no longer stands outside to describe. The safe distance disappears. You are no longer being observed from the outside. You are in that room, with the same walls, the same light, the same repetition. Analysis becomes useless when direct experience takes over. You no longer ask whether this makes sense. You only know that you must hold on to something that is yours. Madness, if it must be named, is not the loss of mind. It is a way of existing under conditions that can no longer be endured in the old way. When every path considered healthy leads to your disappearance, choosing another path becomes inevitable, not to destroy, but to continue being a conscious human being. This is the peak of the journey, not because it is the most violent, but because it exposes most clearly the relationship between control and resistance. When autonomy is taken away in the name of care, resistance may appear in forms outsiders do not understand, and that lack of understanding deepens the tragedy. The room does not collapse when this part ends. The door remains closed. Order is still maintained. But the way you exist within that space has changed irreversibly. You are no longer the person who entered, believing the room was there to help you. You have become someone who knows that sometimes preserving consciousness requires stepping outside accepted definitions of sanity. When you remain in that room, everything looks the same. But something has shifted, not in the space, but in how you understand control. And once that understanding forms, there is no returning to the state before you realized that sometimes what is called madness is the last remaining sign of resistance. After you pass through the room, you cannot leave after understanding that some forms of control are called by very gentle names. Nothing immediately shifts into a clearly defined new chapter. There is no moment of closing the book, no sense of victory or defeat, only aftershocks, a lingering state in which you realize you are no longer standing on the same ground as before. The Victorian era seen from here does not end in a spectacular collapse. It ends in exhaustion, a slow depletion of the belief that humans can arrange everything according to their will. After all the efforts to control, classify, repair, and improve, there remain too many things that refuse to settle into the system. And at some point, people begin to doubt the desire for control itself. The legacy Gothic leaves behind no longer rests in familiar images. Not ghosts in corridors, not decaying houses, not monsters standing outside social boundaries. Those images have completed their work. What remains is a habit of seeing the world, a persistent sense that order is only temporary, that stable surfaces conceal many things that cannot be fully resolved. As you move beyond this phase, fear also changes shape. It no longer centers on people harming one another or systems suffocating individuals. Those still exist, but they are no longer central. The center shifts farther out, beyond morality, beyond intention. You begin to face a reality that does not need you in order to continue existing. The universe in this view holds no malice. It also holds no compassion. It does not observe you. It does not judge you. It does not even know you are there. And that indifference creates a different kind of unease, colder and wider. There is nothing to fight against, no one to blame, no system to repair. Before, fear usually had a center, an individual, a mistake, a structure of power. You could point to it and say this is the problem. But when the center disappears, you lose your footing. You are no longer in a story where humans are the main characters. You are only a very small part of a whole that was not designed to care about your experience. This feeling does not cause panic in the usual sense. It does not make you want to run. It makes you stop, to recognize your smallness, not in a moral sense of humility, but in an existential one. That your existence is not a necessary condition for the world to continue operating. That if you disappeared, the larger order would not need to adjust. At this point, Gothic is no longer a genre about what is hidden within society. It becomes a way of preparing the mind for not being prioritized, a way of learning to live with the idea that not every question has an answer and not every fear comes from a mistake that can be fixed. The aftershock of this shift does not explode. It leaves a void, a space where old beliefs no longer function, but new ones have not yet formed. You do not panic in that void. You are simply more awake, less illusioned, less certain of your place within the larger order. Here, no grand conclusion is offered, no redemptive message, only a quiet acknowledgement that after all the efforts to understand and control fear, you have entered a different phase, one in which the world does not need to be frightening to be unsettling. It only needs to be indifferent. When this part closes, you do not feel directly threatened. You feel distant, as if the center has shifted out of reach. And in that distance, Gothic is no longer a whisper in the darkness of old rooms. It becomes a cold, lingering echo, reminding you that some things were never built around humanity, no matter how strongly humanity once believed they were. After the cold distance of a universe that does not need you, a very human reaction appears. Not panic, not denial, but a need to feel lighter, as if after holding your breath for too long, you finally allow yourself to exhale, even if only a little. There is a moment in this journey when fear no longer holds absolute seriousness, not because it disappears, but because you have looked at it long enough. When distance forms what once felt unbearably heavy, begins to reveal other edges, not to be dismissed, but to be seen more fully. Humor appears not as betrayal. It does not deny what has happened. It does not claim fear was unreal. It does one very simple thing. It makes fear less exclusive. When you can smile at what once tightened your body, you regain a small part of agency without needing to win. There is something deeply human in realizing that even images built to inspire fear can fall out of rhythm, not because they were never frightening, but because the context has changed. When you no longer approach them with absolute reverence, they begin to reveal their own awkwardness. The ghost in this moment is no longer the center of power, not because it has been defeated, but because it is no longer placed on a pedestal. It is still there with its old habits, with scare tactics repeated too many times. But the world around it has changed. Human reactions have changed. A very subtle reversal takes place. When fear is no longer treated as sacred, it begins to look tired. Not tragic tiredness, but something ordinary, like a role performed for too long before an audience that no longer reacts the same way. And in that shift, humanity appears on both sides. Humans are no longer perfect victims. They are clumsy, sometimes carelessly insensitive, but they go on living. And the one called the monster is no longer a pure symbol. It becomes a misplaced presence, stuck in a role that no one truly needs anymore. Humor here does not mock pain. It simply allows you to see that fear and absurdity can exist together, that acknowledging this does not diminish what came before. Instead, it makes the experience more human, less symbolic, less distant. This release does not erase the aftershocks of earlier parts. You still carry unease. Still, remember the cold of an indifferent universe. Still, do not forget the room you could not leave. But now you allow yourself not to stand rigid the entire time. You allow a moment out of rhythm where a smile is not a sign of forgetting, but a sign of continuing. If laughter appears, it is not loud. It does not break the space. It arrives as a small, unexpected sound, almost private. A deeply human reflex upon realizing that even in stories built from fear, there is room for clumsiness, for exhaustion, for imperfect missteps. When this part closes, you do not feel that everything has been resolved. You simply feel a little lighter, as if the weight has been set down for a moment just long enough for you to breathe before stepping into the final moment. Humor does not pull you out of Gothic. It reminds you that even in darkness, humans still find ways to look at each other and at themselves with a gaze that is slightly less unforgiving. After everything you have passed through, there is no clear moment that marks the end of this journey. No sound of a door closing, no light switches off completely. Only a settling feeling, like leaving a familiar place and realizing you are carrying more than you intended to take with you. You have moved through very different spaces, night streets closed, rooms, houses heavy with memory, deeper levels where sound rises from beneath the floor. You have stood before the fears of society, then the fears of the individual. You have seen how order is built, hidden, stretched, and then cracked. Not all at once, but gradually enough that returning to your original state is no longer possible. What you bring back is not a series of stories to retell. You do not carry details to memorize or symbols to decode. If something truly remains, it is a very slight shift in how you look at familiar things. What once appeared stable now carries a thin layer of caution, not extreme suspicion, but an awareness that all order requires constant support. You do not become more pessimistic. You do not become more afraid, but you realize that safety is not the natural state of the world. It is an effort, an unspoken agreement, a fragile balance between what is spoken and what is held back. And when that balance shifts, the first sensation is rarely panic, but a small misalignment in the rhythm of everyday life. You may begin to notice silences more, not frightening silences, but familiar ones. The silence of a room after everyone has gone to sleep. The silence inside repeated routines. The silence when you do what you always do, but this time with a different feeling. These spaces do not need to be filled. They only need to be recognized. You may also realize that stories about darkness do not always pull you away from daily life. They pull daily life closer. They make ordinary things more noticeable. A closed door, a light was left on, a room you have stayed in too long. These things do not change, but how you exist within them does. At this point, the narrator no longer stands in front of you to guide you, no longer stands behind you to push you forward. The narrator steps back far enough that you no longer rely on that voice as support, not because it has lost value, but because its role is complete. What needed to be pointed out has been pointed out. What cannot be explained has been left as it is. What remains belongs to you, not to analyze further, but to live with. To carry this feeling into very ordinary days, into work, into relationships, into small decisions you rarely question. Not to doubt everything, but to notice when something begins to no longer match its surface. The aftertone of this journey does not sound like a warning. It feels like a quiet reminder that you have once seen beneath the surface layers, that you know the feeling of order under strain of control becoming a burden of indifference opening a cold space, and that you also know the feeling of humans finding ways to breathe, to laugh, and to continue even without complete answers. You do not need to hold all of this in your mind. It does not demand constant remembrance. It simply exists, ready to surface when you need a different way of seeing. When you stand in a familiar room and sense that something does not fully align. When you hear a repeating sound and wonder why it remains. When you realize that normality is sometimes only a thin covering. When darkness is no longer in front of you, but remains behind. What you bring back is not fear, it is the ability to notice. And the only question left, not for this story but for you, is what you will do with what you have noticed.